start with Midrashim on last week's learning. Last week we learned Perek Chaf Daled, chapter 24 of 1 Samuel Shmuel Aleph, the story primarily of David's encounter with Naval, the very brutal Ish Belial, the very brutal lowlife. That's really what an Ish Belial is, a lowlife, who would not give any food or anything despite his incredible wealth, and David was going to kill him. His men were starving to death, and along came Abigail, the wife of Nabal, who heard about this from one of his men, and she hastened quickly to stop. She just knew that bad things were going to happen to her husband, and she ran to David with all kinds of goods. She had her men, associates who worked for her, bring all kinds of foods and drink and everything, and to take care of his men, and to plead, please don't hurt my husband, and don't spill blood. You've never in your life, David, spilled blood. Don't spill blood. And he blessed her for having stopped him from spilling blood, realized he should not have. And she went back home, told her husband what she had done. Well, she didn't do it that night. That night he was having a gigantic party celebrating the successful conclusion of the annual sheep shearing, big thing for them in the sheep business. And then the next morning when he was sober, because he was stone drunk that night while the party, the next morning when he was sober, she told him that he was about to get killed, and she saved his life. And when he heard, not that she saved his life, not that he was about killed, but when he heard, and so she saved his life by bringing certain amounts of his property, of his food, of his meat, and of the sheep. When he heard that some of his property was brought over to David and given away, he had a stroke. Like, he literally had a stroke. Not just like he had a stroke. He had a stroke. And he went into a coma for 10 days, and then he died. And when David found out about it, David told Abigail, he said that you're a righteous woman, you're a brilliant woman of great intelligence, great spirituality, and I think we could be good together. And so they married. And then it tells us he also married a third wife right afterwards. And Janet was asking about what about what's going on? Doesn't he have to talk to Michal, his first wife? And we're going to talk about that today. And then it concludes with that King Saul took his daughter Michal, whom Saul had given to David in wedding and marriage, and now took her away from David and gave her to another man named Palti, or Paltiel. There are two versions, the same person basically. And there are all kinds of questions about that. How could a king, if he feels someone is rebellious, he can order the person to be executed. But a king can't go around taking wives away from people and giving them to other people, even if it's his own daughter. So the rabbis really get into a discussion about that. So we're going to talk about all this, but since I'm spending a little bit of time each class during the last few 10 days or so, teaching you all about Yishai Ribo, the hottest singer in all of Israel. This Saturday night is going to be his concert in Madison Square Garden. Tickets are running between I took a look. Tickets are running between $246 and $1,700 a ticket. $246 is in the nosebleed sections, and $1,700 is where you actually could see him. It's amazing how big he is. I'm just going to play one song and then a 1-minute clip that I showed 2 weeks ago. The theme is going to be, since the theme is about husbands and wives, this is a song in which I played it once before, in which the woman isn't on stage, but the lyrics are, he's singing to his wife that basically, you made me a success, you've been with me at my every success, and you made me what I am. And it's just that, as with all of his songs, they're spiritual and they're inspirational, and they're not dirty, and they're not all this stuff of secular music. They're just so inspirational. Anyway, here we go. And as you can see, he has a following.
מזל שיש אותה.
And as I mentioned last time I played it, notice that that audience of thousands all know the words to the song. So for us, it's new. For us, it's new, but for the people of Israel, his songs are very, very big. He's very, very big, and everybody knows his songs. So that I really want to point out for you, like, he's really big, and we don't know about him in America. And we love Israel, and we like to be on top of everything to do with Israel. And so, while we're doing everything else, I did want to teach you about one of the most important cultural developments there in the last 2-3 years, and the idea that it's a guy with a yarmulke and tzitzis, and he's not ashamed, and he attracts non-religious people because his themes. So here, Mazal, which you know means good luck. Sheyesh otach, it is my good luck that I have you, referring to the wife.
תמיד את מנגנת, תמיד שלמה עם עצמך, ברוח את מלטפת, מתארי אהבתך, איזה מזל.
מזל שיש אותה, את מבינה אותי ואת מראה לי את עצמי, מתלהב כמו ילד, מתפנק בך ואז אני נשאר איתה.
You show compassion to me like my mother, and you've helped me succeed in every way. The way this third man with the baseball cap sings, he's one of Israel's most famous Sephardic singers. And you know that if you've ever heard Sephardic singing, it's that kind of like Arab style of singing.
אני שקוע בנסתר שבך, אוהב מה שגלוי, אני עבד לחוכמה שלך, אין בך כלום שפוי. איזה מזל שיש אותך. וריחמת עליי כמו וניצחת איתי הכל.
כל לילה אני בא, את רזי צניעותך, את נותנת לי ללמוד
And then the other, I showed it on a Sunday, just for those of us who weren't there on Sunday to see it 2 weeks ago. There was a lady who was going to get married, and the wedding date, again, the theme being weddings and marriage, because of David marrying first of all Abigail and then the other wife. And so in this theme of marriage, today's class, this other thing, this lady was supposed to get married, and then shortly before her wedding, she was diagnosed with cancer, and her wedding had to be delayed. And he found out about it.
Can I come in? How are you? Oh, wow. Shabbat. Today really hard with you. Oh, you made a hole. It's not bad. Okay.
היי, מזל טוב, אלישבע וג'וש היקרים ואהובים, לרגל החתונה שלכם, רצון שיהיה לכם סייעתא דשמיא תמיד, ושלום בית אמיתי, ושמחה גדולה בחיים, שתמיד מאושרים ומבינים ומכילים אחד את השני. ואני רוצה להקדיש לכם פזמון קטן, עם פסוק חשוב שאנחנו נוהגים לומר, שבע ברכות.
ותשמע בבית זה כל ששון וכל שמחה. ותשמע בבית זה כל חתן וכל כלה. ותשמע בבית זה כל ששון וכל שמחה. מזל.
It's a lot of good in our community, a lot of good people. And you don't read about these in the newspaper. The newspaper reports are always the bad news about bad people and bad things they do and bad things they say. You never read about this. Not in our papers either, when people do good things and kind things. It would be nice. Imagine if all the newspapers instead, just one day a year, would announce, today we're reporting only good news. Our editorials are only going to be encouraging good people to keep up what they're doing. And we want to just give coverage today to good news. If they ever did it, they'd come back in their issues of April 2nd and say, we hope you enjoyed April Fool's Day yesterday. That's just the news. That's a shame. Let's go into the texts now. Okay. And thank you so much for being here. Okay. First of all, let's go with the main texts. Oops, let's bring that down now. To do that, we have to stop that. Okay. First of all, I want to take a look at Midrash Shmuel. Let's see why. Midrash Shmuel, it's a Midrash on Shmuel, and among other things, it talks about our chapter. Now, chapter 25 had begun, which is what we did last week, by Amat Shmuel. It had begun with the death of Samuel. It ended up with everything I described in the overview, but it began by Amat Shmuel, and Shmuel died by Kavtzu Kol Yisrael, by Espedulo, the entire nation of Israel gathered and mourned him. By Baruhu B'Veito Ramah, he was buried at his home, in his home property in Ramah. By Akam David Vayered Al Midbar Paran, and David went down to the wilderness of Paran. So Midrash talks about it. Katuv Echad Omer Vayamat Shmuel. If you can read Hebrew, the wording was Vayamat Shmuel. There are two ways to say it, to say that Shmuel died in Hebrew. You could say Vayamat Shmuel, or you could say Shmuel met. And that's going to be, if I jump down to chapter 28, verse 3. So let's take a quick jump to chapter 28, verse 3. Ushmuel met Vayespedulo Kol Yisrael Vayikbaruhu B'Ramah V'Iro. And Shmuel had died, and all Israel made lament for him, and he was buried in this town of Ramah. Why does it say the same thing again? We'll get to it later. You'll see that it's a different context and it makes sense. But unlike the first place where it said, Vayamat Shmuel, in chapter 28, it says, Ushmuel made, which is the same meaning, Shmuel, of course, Samuel, Vayamat, mate, it's the same. It means dead, death, but it's a slightly different structure. And the Midrash wants to know, is there anything we can learn? Is there any hidden meaning or subtle meaning in a different way of wording it? Okay, so Amar Avasi, who Shmuel met, mitavadai. On the one hand, Rabbi Asi says, when it says in chapter 28, Shmuel met, it means that he was definitely dead, and that's important in the context of the narrative of chapter 28, and we'll get to it. Just to give you a little insight, but not much, King Saul, in accordance with the Torah law, had banned fortune-telling and witches, witchcraft, palm reading, fortune-telling. All those things are forbidden in the Torah. And Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, had banned it throughout the country. You know, when I drive, another one of my simchas is to sometimes drive to Hoag Hospital, where they get a chance to look me over also. Everybody enjoys watching this lung. It's like the biggest thing in town. So anyway, when we drive to Newport Beach, there's actually a fortune-telling storefront that we pass. It shocks me. In fact, there are two of them. One on the west side of Newport Beach Boulevard and one on the east of Newport Boulevard. When people are really wealthy with nothing to do with their money, so you have fortune tellers. Either that or in poverty-stricken communities where people have no money, you also have fortune tellers. He banned fortune tellers. And in chapter 28, it comes out that he himself wants to go to a fortune teller. And the question is, why would he go to a fortune teller? Let him go to the prophet Samuel. So it reminds us in chapter 28, he couldn't go to the prophet Samuel because Shmuel had died. So that's why I mentioned it again there. We'll get to it and you'll see the story. Nevertheless, right here, they're asking why the two different structures. Okay. So Vayamat Shmuel here, Ein Devarim Amurin, Ela Le'inyano Shel Nava. The only reason it even told us here in chapter 25 last week and now that Samuel died is that it's connected, interestingly, with the story of Naval, the rich guy who has the stroke and dies. What's the connection? Shene'emar Vayamat Shmuel, it says, and Shmuel died. V'samichle v'ish b'ma'on u'maseh b'Karmel. And afterwards, it gets into the whole story of Naval, that there's a man from Ma'on, and he's got people working in Carmel, and all the sheep, yada, yada, yada. El Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the holy HaKadosh Baruch Hu means Kadosh means holy, Baruch means blessed, Hu means he, H-E. So the Holy One, blessed is he. That's another name of God, Kadosh Baruch Hu. So Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, Hakol sofdin v'tovchin al libo al mitato shel tzaddik. Everybody in the nation is mourning and beating their breasts, and there's pain in their hearts over the death that just was announced of this extraordinary righteous man, this tzaddik. V'harasha hazeh yoshev yozemer zachim. Except one guy among the nation, he's not interested that Samuel died. He's busy making money. He's busy finishing up the sheep shearing. So Aval David Mahu Omer, Horego Nerad, Rodefo Nerdaf. What does David do? David, who's on the run for his life from King Saul, says even though he's on the run for his life, he pauses to pay homage to or homage to the deceased Samuel. Okay, Holech, he says, Ani va'oseh gemilut chesed l'tzadik. I'm going to pay my respects and more. So that's the context that Samuel died, And Naval is still busy shearing sheep. It's like in the United States, God forbid. I remember when President Kennedy was assassinated. President Kennedy was assassinated, the whole country stopped. I guess I'm, as always, showing my age, which at a certain point, who cares? It means I have wisdom. So when President Kennedy died, do you remember? For those, you don't have to admit, nobody else has to admit you're as old as I am, but they closed down the country. I wonder if America would do that today for a president. I hope it never happens for any president, but they closed down the country. In fact, all of television closed down, and all you could get on television for like 100 hours was the same identical camera work, filming the mourning and pallbearers and the caisson being carried, and then the burial, the whole, and following Jackie Kennedy. And it was like the whole country, that's all you could get on television. Nowadays, you know, even in a big national moment when the whole country should stop, and when the three networks actually do, CBS, ABC, NBC, and Fox, the four, even now, 90% of the country go onto cable and they watch miniseries and nobody cares. It's just a different world. But you may remember the whole country slowed down, the whole country stopped. So that's what happened when Samuel died. Makes sense. Shmuel was at least John F. Kennedy. He was the prophet and leader of the generation. So the whole nation stopped, except for Naval. Business, the show must go on. And so that's what they're bringing out. The difference of a righteous person who stops even when he's being pursued. And they cite from the book of Psalms, chapter 13. In the Psalm, it says, and I, in your chesed, in your grace and kindness, I believe. That David always believed in kindness in all of his deeds. It comes to teach any person who denies the centrality and primacy of doing kind deeds, being kind to people, doing chesed, kindness. Anyone who denies the centrality of kindness as the single most important thing in life is like someone who denies God himself, who denies the essence of all. A person must be kind. It is central. It's the whole purpose of the Torah. It's the purpose of all the mitzvot. We have to do the mitzvot. It does not mean, oh, I'm very kind, so I don't have to keep Shabbat. I'm very kind, I don't have to be kosher. No. You have to be kosher. You have to keep Shabbat. And those all psychologically contribute to creating kindness. Person who keeps Shabbat over the course of time will invite people to his home and her home to eat Shabbat meals. Visitors coming through town with nowhere to stay. Why go to the Hilton or the Motel 6? Come to our home, sleep over, and eat at our home. Be our Shabbat guests. That's what it does. It makes you kind. Shabbat makes you kind. Likewise, kashrut. When you're kosher, you end up having a consciousness of food, and a consciousness that other people need food. And I mean, in my lifetime, we've given a lot of food to tzedakah. And so it goes. You have a charitable, you have a simcha, Hanukkah, Purim, you have leftover food, and you arrange to have it distributed to the poor. And all the mitzvahs are supposed to make you kind. Someone who does all the mitzvahs, Shabbos and Kashrus and everything, and is a cruel person, that's not a religious Jew. That's a person with serious issues that have to be resolved. Okay. And the other piece of Midrash I want to share with you, and then I'm going to go into an interesting study of the Malbim, a rabbi who discusses this whole thing with Michal and everything like that. And then we'll finally come back to Janet's question. But first, Tana Devei Eliyahu Zuta, from Seder Eliyahu Zuta. This is a Midrash. The Midrash says, Gedolat tzedakah shematzelet et ha'adam. Giving charity is great, and so great that it saves a person mider hamita, from death. It actually saves you from death. When you give charity, it extends your life. Gedolah tzedakah, great is the giving of charity. Tzedakah is so great, shema'arechet yamav ushnotav shel adam. It makes a person's years longer. You will live longer if you're charitable. What about a person who's charitable and dies at a young age? They would have died even younger had they not been charitable. And it also adds to the eternity of their years in the world to come. So charity, the rabbis tell us, is so great. Not only should you do it for its own purpose, I mean, a good purpose. If you have a good soul, and if you've internalized what I just taught a few moments ago, that the centrality and primacy of Jewish belief is to be a righteous person, a good person. So you should be giving charity even if you don't get anything for it, because it's the way of life. It's like breathing. It's like eating and drinking. You give charity. It's part of life. Person who doesn't give charity, that's Naval. That's the man who died of a stroke when he found out that his wife gave charity from his property. Give charity. But the payoff is that God will lengthen your days and years. Gedolah tzedakah shehi meviah et ha'adam lechayei ha'olam haba. Great is charity because it helps bring your soul to the world to come, to the eternal work, to eternal life. You know, our lives, when we get buried, we all get buried. Does it end at that point? That's the great question. We, as religious Jews, believe so strongly, there's no doubt in our minds, that this life is a passageway, a pathway to the world to come. And what kind of life will we have in the world to come? It'll be like this life. Everybody has a different life. In this life, this one has more money, this one has less money. This one has an illness, this one's healthy. This one is born into a good family, this one's born. This life, everybody's got a different starting point. It's the same way in the world to come, only one difference. This life, we weren't given a choice which life we were born into, whether we were born into slavery or freedom or poverty or wealth. We were given opportunities in many cases to overcome the negative or ruin the good, but we weren't given a choice. For the world to come, where we begin and the life we have is based on the choices we will have made in this life. And one of the central choices is giving charity. Tzedakah shehi meviat adam l'chayei olam haba. Gedolah tzedakah sheshavta l'torah gedolah. Shavta l'Torah. Great is charity that it is compared as equal to the Torah itself. Gedolat tzedakah Torah shavta. Gedolat tzedakah shehi mamaheret yom ben David. Great is charity because if the Jewish people will give charity, it hastens the day when God will send the Messiah, the son of David, from the house of David, the tribe of Judah. Great is charity because it raises the soul. It raises, in our lifetimes, we deposit so that it's there to be collected in the world to come. And on the Yortzeit, the anniversary of someone's death, we give tzedakah to raise up and uplift and elevate their souls. We believe that on the day that my father passed away, his Yortzeit in December, in Cheshvan, and the day that my mother passed away in Shvat in January or February, and Ellen Zichrona Livracha passed away in July and Tammuz, 10th of Tammuz. On these days, I give extra tzedakah because I truly believe, because this is what I've been taught. This is what the text says. Shehi ma'aleh et haneshama. It elevates and raises up the soul in the world to come. They ask in Bereshit Rabbah, a different midrash, what can you do in this life on behalf of those whom you love and who have died? What can you do for them? So the rest of the world, what do? They plant flowers. It's the anniversary. They call up the cemetery. What is it? $50, $100, $25. They plant flowers. They go visit the cemetery. Very, very, very wonderful thing. In Judaism, we give charity on that day also. That's the central thing, to give tzedakah on the day of the Yortzeit. Okay, so we have all of this about tzedakah. Why am I telling you all this? Because it ties in with the midrash, with what you learned. How is it? Uminayin ata omer shekol mi shesipek biado lasot tzedakah ve'eno oseh. And how do you know that a person who has wealth, who has what to donate, to give charity, however, does not, ve'eno oseh? How do we know that one who has the ability to give charity but does not, ulekayem nefashot ve'eno mitkayem, and has the ability to help sustain people's lives with his charity, but is simply a miser and refuses to do so? So how do we know that such a person, gorem mitaliatzmo, brings about an earlier death for himself, that one who could be charitable has the ability and doesn't do it, actually brings his own death closer, which you would infer if giving charity adds years, then being a miser and refusing to be charitable, not surprisingly, detracts years, subtracts years. How do we know? From our chapter. That's why I'm teaching you this out of this midrash. From Shmuel Aleph Chafei, from 1 Samuel chapter 25. Vaya'an Naval, where Naval said, I'm not giving any charity. You out of your mind? How did he put it? He said in verse 11, should I take my bread and my water? Are you crazy? And the meat that I slaughtered of the sheep for my own shearers and give them to men who come from I don't know where? Are you nuts? So that's what he said. And he was dead within a day. That doesn't always, being a miser doesn't, it's not normally that direct. It's very rare that someone who has punishment coming really gets it right away. One time in my life, I was on the 405 freeway with Ellen, Zichron Livracha, and by miracle, traffic was moving. Because usually if you've been on the 405, it just doesn't move. You could just walk from New York, from Irvine to LA and get there faster. Anyway, the traffic was open, and some maniac on the road, parked in front of my car, almost lopped off my front left side of my car. Parked in front of my car at like 90 miles an hour. And it was like a shock. And I remember I did say to Ellen, I said to Ellen, this guy's going to get his one day. And sure enough, he tried to straighten out his car. He shot in front of me, tried to straighten out his car, but he was going so fast he couldn't. His car turned around and it went down an incline, a decline, like a ravine. And I don't know what became of him. But that was a rare case where a guy got his, but good, just like he deserved. Doesn't always happen that way. Okay. Anyway, it doesn't always happen that way, but it did happen with Naval. So he said, what happened to Umiyad Ne'enash? Immediately, he was punished. But as it says, in 10 days, he was in his bed 10 days, by Gofa Shemet Naval Vayamot. Okay? And so I wanted to teach you these midrashim, because as I continually have said, there's so much more in the text than the fascinating, interesting stories of the Bible itself. There are so many lessons, even though it's not the first 5 books, the Torah, the Chumash, and it's not necessarily read every week in shul, but there's so much. So in the story of Naval, we learn all about tzedakah and the centrality of being righteous. And it's really important stuff to take home. And now I want to also go to this. I prepared the text for you. And this is a rabbi known as the Malbim. The Malbim was one of the great commentators on the Tanakh and on the Torah. Rashi is the most famous. And then there were Ibn Ezra and Ramban And there were some, in fact, Ramban, we just studied on Sunday, he was talking about and really fleshing out the story of the concubine of Giva, the Pelegish Giva. Fascinating Ramban we spent. Today we're going to look at Malbim is commenting on the following. And we talked about it. We had both no time, and because it would be an extended study, it was meant to be for this class anyway. That King Saul took away his daughter, whom he had given David as a wife, and we know she was a very loving wife and a devoted wife, when her father tried to have David finally killed by sending his sentries to David's home and like right at the front door. And so he's going to have to come out, and I want him taken to the palace, and we're going to execute him on the spot. And David figured it out. So David planned that he's going to go out the window with like bed sheets. Maybe you've seen the movies like that. And to set stuff up on his bed and put a blanket to make it look like there's a guy in the bed. So that when the sentries finally did come in, Michal covered for him, his wife, and said, he's not feeling well, he's in bed. And they saw like a lump in bed. I mean, the image that comes to mind, I mean, this is serious stuff. This is life and death. And I can't help but remember Ferris Bueller. If you've ever seen Ferris Bueller, that's how he cut out school. Remember how he used to miss school? He would set up his bed like that, and maybe he studied the Bible. And so his mother would look in the bedroom, Ferris, and he had like a tape recording. In those days, they had tape recording that when the door opened, it automatically turned on the tape recorder that said, "Mom, I'm sick." And so she sees the lump, she hears, "Mom, I'm sick. Mom, I'm sick." If she would have stayed in the room long enough, she would have heard, "Mom, I'm sick. Mom, I'm sick. Mom, I'm sick. Mom, I'm sick. Mom, I'm sick." But perfectly, she only listens once or twice and goes out. So anyway, Michal saved his life. Michal covered for him. She loved him dearly. So the question is, how could he just go and take on other wives? By law, he was allowed. The Bible, the Torah, permits polygamy, and polygamy was allowed until really for Jews until approximately the year 1000. And when the Meir Hagolah, I'm just going blank a second, but but he was known as the Meir Hagolah, the light of the exile. Rabbeinu, I was just learning a Rabbeinu Hananel, and I can't get his name out of my head. But anyway, 1,000 years ago, a ruling was handed down that we are permitted finally that we're required to marry only one person, monogamy.
Rabbi Gershom.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. Rabbeinu Gershom. Thank you, Ruth. Rabbeinu Gershom, Meir Hagolah, the light of the exile, and he ruled. Jews by then were living under Christian society, and he perceived that it was promoting terrible anti-Semitism, deathly anti-Semitism, when Christians saw some Jews marrying more than one. Even though we're allowed to marry more than one at that time, most people did not because they couldn't afford it. Women did not go out to earn a living, and one man could not afford more than one wife and household. So typically people did not do it, but the wealthy did, and it prompted the same kind of anger and hatred that the Mormons encountered in the United States. When the Mormons started marrying a lot of people in one family, the polygamy, the next thing they knew, they were getting massacred. They had to leave New York, and they had to relocate to Chicago, I believe. And then they got massacred in Chicago, and they killed the main Mormon guy. And then they had to go off. One of them was, again, but I know Brigham Young is the next guy. And then they went and they finally landed in Utah because nobody was in Utah, and they saw the Salt Lake, and it looked to them like the Sea of Galilee, and they thought that was the promised land. So it brought death on them, polygamy. So Rabbeinu Gershom ordered no more, but in biblical times, you're allowed to marry more than one. And the king was allowed to marry even more than the average person. Nevertheless, I mean, you love your wife. Don't you talk to your wife? So let's take a look at this Malbim, and then I'll take questions or comments on it. V'Shaul natan Michal bita. He's commenting on, and Saul gave his daughter Michal over to another man. Hinei, hitpalu. You know, it's amazing. It's one I can't figure it out. It's shocking. Ech natan Shaul et bito shehayata eshet ish la'acher. How, by what right did Saul give his daughter, who was properly married, to another man? How could she do it? How could he do it? Ve'ech lakcha David achar kach b'chazara achrehu tamah. And later on in the text, we're not up to it yet, but in another chapter or two, we're going to learn that David takes Michal back. So Saul gave Michal to Paltiel, or Palti. Let's take a look at that text. And then later on, we're going to learn, I'm not going to go grab it now, but take my word for it, he's going to take Michal back. Let's take a look. At the end of 25. Here we go. Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish. Eshet David, Natanet Michal, Bito Eshet David, Lefalti ben Laish. Okay, fine. Back to Malbim. So how could he have taken away David's wife? And how could David then go and take her back if she's already someone else's wife? What's going on here? Vayomer Haradak, Rabbi David Kimchi, another great commentator on the Navi, on the prophet, says, Sheshaol anasat David lagarsha. His opinion is that it is not in the text, but King Saul coerced David to divorce Michal. Wow. It's not in the text, but there's other things. There's a lot of things that are not in the text. You only get a few, really, in a person's life of 70 years or 100 years. If the Torah or the Tanakh tells us 10 things they did in their lives, 5 stories, that's a lot. So it doesn't tell you every detail. When Abraham married Sarah, it really does not tell us about the wedding. It doesn't really just tells us, we just take it for granted. It mentions that Abraham's married to Sarah. So some of these weddings don't get a big write-up. So happens to be that he divorced her. There's an opinion that Moshe Rabbeinu maybe divorced Tzipporah. There's a discussion. His wife Tzipporah, whom he married at the home of Yitro, the Kohen of Midian. Later on, when you get to around chapter 11, I think, of Sefer Bamidbar, where it talks about that they were speaking evil about Tzipporah, there's an opinion that that they had been divorced. It's certainly not in the text. So there's a lot of things not in the text. So Radak says David had divorced Michal, and that would make it, even if he did it under the compulsion of his father-in-law, who after all wanted to kill him, that would make it more easy to understand, number one, how Saul could give her to someone else. Number two, how David could marry someone else without consulting with Michal, because they're no longer married. If that's true, that's an opinion. Ubechol zot echsira David, ki haya get meusa upasul. And the Radak says later so how could David take her back? It happens to be in the Torah. Let me show you. It's a lot of us don't necessarily know this, but in the Torah, let's just get the text. Let's pick it up here. This is going to be, let's just find ourselves. I hope I'm not going to take too much of your time because I'm calling an audible here, but it's something like chapter 25 or 23. Give me a second. 25 or 23 on divorce. No, it's not 25. Maybe it's 24 or 23. Divorce, the laws of divorce. So in the Torah, just give me another moment here. And if I don't find it really quickly, I'll just tell it to you, but I'd like to show it to you in the text, if I can find it real quickly. And otherwise, it's going to just a second. Or just come on. Yeah. All right. Anyway, I probably passed it. The Torah, it tells us that a person may get divorced. It tells us about divorce. It also tells us that if you do get divorced, you are allowed subsequently to remarry. sort of like Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. You can get divorced, you can get remarried. The only one who cannot do that is a Kohen, because a Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee. So if a Kohen divorces his wife, he's got to be very careful, can't let his temper get too hot, because he can't change his mind later. Okay. But otherwise, you can remarry. However, the Torah adds, if someone gets divorced, and now the woman marries someone else, there you go. There you go. I passed chapter 24. If the woman gets divorced and then marries someone else, then the original husband no longer could marry her again. If Richard Burton would, if they were all Jewish, if Richard Burton married Elizabeth Taylor, and if she really were Jewish, which she wasn't really, and then if they get divorced, and let's say she marries Fohensky or whatever his name was, and then she gets divorced, Richard Burton would not be allowed to marry her again. You can't marry your divorced wife if she's gone on to marry someone else and then got divorced. If a man takes a woman and he cohabits with her, then it shall be. If he does not find favor in his eyes, his having found in her a thing of nakedness, he shall write a scroll of divorce, a get. He shall place it in her hand. He shall send her from his house. As with everything, there's a lot more going on here. We don't have time to go into it, but that's the surface. And she shall go out of his house. And she shall go out and be to another man, a wife to another man. Different from the first. Okay. And the second man, if he hates her, and he decides to write her a scroll of divorce, a get, and place it in her hand, and she's sent from his house, and it happens, the second man dies or whatever the case may be, the first husband who had sent her away shall not be able to return to take her to be to him as a wife after she's been defiled, etc. And that's an abomination for him to take her back. Okay. So that is background. If you accept Radak's opinion that David divorced Michal, then how is it possible if David divorced Michal, how could he then take her back later? Because in between she married Palti. So Radak says, because the first divorce under Jewish law in the Talmud, someone who gives a get under coercion, the get is not valid. A person cannot be coerced to marry, and a person who's married cannot be coerced to divorce. The woman has to willingly accept the get. The man has to willingly give the get, the bill of divorce. So according to Radak, David did not willingly give the divorce, but was forced by his father-in-law. Therefore, it was not a kosher divorce. Therefore, he could take her back because according to the rabbis, she never had physical contact with Palti. Palti was a righteous, holy man. He knew that he had been given the wife of David wrongfully, and as such, he never touched her. That's our tradition. Consequently, David could take her back. Continuing, Vayomer Mahari, Shalo notna lefaltiya la'isha, rak l'shomra v'chol zeh rachok. Okay, so according to what I just told you, Paltiel was given Michal primarily to guard her, that she shouldn't be alone during the interregnum, during the interim, while this craziness was going on where David was coerced to divorce her. Though it was not a valid divorce, she shouldn't go back to her father's house. She should go somewhere safe. And Paltiel, they felt, was so righteous. Imagine like a person who's like there are some who say he's like the most righteous person who ever lived, that he was able to resist the temptation, having a woman under his roof and all of that. So the Malbim, who's quoting, says, I don't know, this sounds rachok. This sounds kind of far away. I don't know if that jives with the text. So first of all, he says, Malbim says, actually, the majority of rabbis understand it differently. Here's how they understand it. According to Jewish law, when you get married, you have to give the man has to give the woman something of tangible monetary value. In the old days, he gave money. Nowadays, he gives a ring. In the secular world, a ring is perceived as an act of love. A non-Jewish marriage, when they give a ring, the man gives the woman a ring, the woman gives the man a ring, and it's understood as an act of love. I'm giving you something, you're giving me something. They inscribe things on it. In Judaism, the ring actually is not an act of love. It's perceived as such, and why spoil everybody's good feelings? But actually, it's a purchase. According to the Torah, you're buying a wife. The man is buying a wife. Now, he's not going to like eBay and just saying, here's my credit card, I'll take that one. And then they reject your credit card. The thing is that he's buying a wife that becomes his property in biblical times. And that meant also that he had responsibilities. He has to take care of her. He has to provide all of her food needs, her clothing, her home. He has to take care of her. We would turn to learning on Sundays about the concubine and how differently with a concubine, he has no obligations at all. Doesn't have to feed her, doesn't have to house her, doesn't have to clothe her. But with a wife, you have to take good care of her. And there's more Talmudic discussion. He's got to treat her well. He's got to treat her well. He's got to give her respect. He's got to show her love and affection. It's like a whole thing. But it begins with a transaction. Okay. So if you understand that, the ring under the chuppah is not an act of love per se, though there's love involved, of course there is. But you basically have two witnesses under the chuppah who are asked by the rabbi, please look at the ring. Are you persuaded that it has monetary value? That it's a shaveh pruta, that it's worth at least a penny, where today's, what's a penny worth anyway? It's worth at least a dime. So they'll look at it. And if it looks like it came out of a Cracker Jack box, if the guy really is a cheapo and he happened to get a ring in a Cracker Jack box, or he's using the flip top from a can of Coke, right? Oh my God, I'm so lucky. I don't have to spend on a ring. According to Jewish law, I just pulled off this thing from the cup. She could put it on her finger, and so the witnesses would look at it and say, no, it's not, it has no monetary value, or it's got monetary value that's so insignificant that it doesn't make it. And that's why they'll look at the ring, but they look at the ring and then they always say it's got monetary value. Based on that, it seems that, now, do you remember the story of when David was on good terms with King Saul? When King Saul said, I'd like you to go to the Philistines, go battle, and bring me back 100 foreskins. Remember that? I think so, because a guy who brings back foreskins, that story is easy. That story we tend to remember longer than some of the other stories. So he came back with the foreskins. There's a midrash that he said to Saul, because the deal was, if you bring back 100 foreskins, I will give you my daughter as a wife. So there's a rabbinic opinion, that actually King David, well, he wasn't the king yet. He was frankly, he was poor. He had no money. He was doing shepherding for his father. It wasn't his sheep. That's why he's so desperate when he's trying to get food from Naval, or when he's trying to get food from the city of Nov, the city of the Kohanes, where he begs them for bread. He's got no money. There is an opinion that when he came back with 100 foreskins, he said to Saul, what was our deal? Our deal was, I bring you back 100 foreskins, you give me your daughter. So I'm buying your daughter with these 100 foreskins. Not 400 skins, 100 foreskins. Anyway, let's continue. According to that opinion, that Shaul ta'ah v'chashav shekiddushei Michal lo hayu kefi hadin. Saul made a mistake. Like, how could Saul have the arrogance to have to have nullified that marriage because he honestly believed that the marriage was invalid. Ki kodsha b'mal v'shel osher shuvtach l'makat Goliath, o shedavid chashav shemea or arelot plishtim shavim pruta, that perhaps David had intended for the 100 foreskins to be material that had a monetary value of more than a penny, and by that he wedded Michal. And Saul incorrectly, therefore, felt that Shaul chashav she'einam shavim klum, and Saul was of the opinion that the 100 foreskins had no monetary value at all. Who's going to go buying Philistine foreskins? I was going to say, I don't even think you could find it on eBay. But you know what? I'll bet you could find it on eBay. You could find anything on eBay. I once just was curious. Some guy was selling his dirty socks on eBay. Dirty socks. I'm sure someone bought them. I'm not sure someone even bothered to wash them. Anyway, David chashav shemea arelot plishtim shavim pruta. So David felt that they were kosher. It was a kosher wedding. V'Shaul chashav she'einam shavim klum. And Saul felt they had no value at all. And therefore, under that understanding, Saul incorrectly felt that he was entitled to pull away the daughter. And uvechizeh haya David mutar lachzira. And Saul was incorrectly thought he could pull away the daughter. There was no divorce. And David pulled her back eventually because she's still his wife. Ki hoya ta anusa al pi beitin shel Shaul shetu badin, because she simply had been forcibly taken away by the court of law that Saul had convened that had ruled incorrectly. Uchamoshehu hahalacha b'misham rulo meit ba'alech v'niseit al pi bet din shalom nesra. And Malbim adds, citing the rabbis, that let's say a woman, her husband goes out to sea and never comes back. And then he just never comes back. Can she ever marry again? Is she divorced? Is she a widow? What is she? So she's considered not forbidden if she married again because the Beis Din permitted it. It happens in such cases. There was quite a situation after 9/11. After 9/11, there were several Orthodox Jews died in 9/11. It's New York. You have Orthodox Jews. It was a building that's financed. A lot of Jews are involved in finance. Another story for another time. And there were Orthodox Jews among them. There were actually stories. It's unbelievably heartbreaking. There were stories. By then, they already had cell phones, not smartphones, but cell phones. With the smoke starting to come in, there were stories of certain individuals who actually called their rabbis, explaining rapidly that they were going to die very soon, and they didn't know what to do. Should they stay in the room and get burned? If they jump out, how can there be evidence for their wives, certified evidence that their wives now may remarry, that they are widowed? And it was discussed at great, they jumped, and they jumped anyway, and they spoke to the rabbis about it. Terrible, terrible thing. If somebody gets lost, and then the question is, likewise, if they go to war and they don't come back, not as prisoners of war, you don't know what happened to them. So in situations like that. But anyway, in this case, this kind of stirred Saul. When he started hearing that because he pulled away Michal, who maybe really is David's wife, and he was messing around with her life, then he heard that David, took Abigail for a wife, and yet a third wife, B'li, and he did it without even consulting Michal. Realizing that's like being disrespectful to the daughter of the king, to take another wife without consulting with her. Exactly Janet's question. And this furthermore now, when Saul heard this, and now it's further going to make his daughter hate him, that she's sitting there realizing that my husband, whom I love, is going around marrying other women because you took me away from him and forced me to be with this other guy. So I wanted to teach you all that, the deeper discussion than the obvious discussion of the text itself. The bottom line, then I'll take Janet's question. The bottom line is that he either did not willingly leave, rather Saul, because of Saul's stuff, pulled her away, and he justified it saying there had never been a kosher marriage when there really had been. So David was permitted later to take her back, but having thought that he's no longer got a wife, he took this extraordinary woman who is beautiful and wealthy and smart. And it wasn't like today where you could say to a woman like that, can I just get your email or your phone number and I'll give you a call. Can I call you? It's like he may never see her again. He's on the run for his life. He may not see her again. You could say, well, 10, 20 years from now when he comes, in 10 years, she'll be married. So that's what's going on. I hope this was interesting for you in learning